Elon, I, the Tetragrammaton, the Lord God Most High, I do exercise thee, and do powerfully command thee, O Spirit. Elon, I, the Tetragrammaton, the Lord God Most High, I do exercise thee, and do powerfully command.
In the dark shadows, in the white cold, fearlessly we search for knowledge new and old. We drink the strong spirits and read the ancient tomes. The order of the Abracast. We are the brave and the bold. Occult, history, conspiracy, and violence.
Hey, welcome to the Abracast, everybody. I'm your host, John Towers. I'm sitting here. I got my laptops open. I'm raring to go. We're doing a bonus episode today. You know, I'm sitting here thinking about what happened in Afghanistan. Everybody's like, oh, he's just an idiot. He's an idiot, and that's what happened. And we did a episode last week, I believe, regarding the track record and the eternal recurrence of Joe Biden. You know, and I want to point out that I made it all the way through that episode without talking about Benghazi once, which was a calculated thing, because I like to leave that at the doorstep of Hillary Clinton. Anyhow, I am ready to go. I got all my shit set up here. I got the vessel of the art. I just got back from my annual camping trip. It was like 200 fucking degrees out. So I actually wound up coming back with quite a bit so when I go on my camping trip is whiskey weekend, right? So I have a little bit of whiskey left, and I decided to do that tonight instead of this gin jihad. So, back in the day, we used to call those a red horse. Here we go. You probably can't tell the difference. You might find out that if you have a bottle of whiskey, there's two kinds of weapons you can make. Well, three if you count, like, if you're going to club somebody with it or maybe stab them with a broken bottle. But the two types of weapons that you can make is Molotov cocktail and me, your host, John Towers. So, okay, anyhow, here we go. Looking at Afghanistan and looking at the way that we've pulled out of Afghanistan, I've really been spending a lot of time looking at what happened in Vietnam in 1975 and this thing called Operation Frequent Wind. I've been actually reading a lot about it. That's what we're going to talk about for this bonus episode. And the whole thing, when you start looking at 1975 versus 2021, is, well, the first thing that I thought of was this quote that's attributed to General Omar Bradley. He was purported to have said, "Amateurs talk about strategy, professionals talk about logistics." And we're going to see I'm going to try not to talk about Afghanistan a whole lot, but if you look at the situation in Afghanistan, you can see there's a logistical it's all a logistics problem. Every decision they made went against supply chain, the way supply chains work, coming in and going out of any given location. So here, let me lube up and we're going to get into this. Vietnam Evacuation, Operation Frequent Wind by Daniel L. Haulman, dates April 4th through September 16th, 1975, the Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnam. So you can see this story isn't a story that can be told over, 2 weeks. Like the army pulls out, there's an instruction that kind of gets out going, hey, everyone should go to the fucking airport, and havoc ensues and the living fucking nightmare begins. And they started this thing in April with a go date of September 16. So Operations U.S. combat troops left the Republic of Vietnam in 1973 according to the terms of a peace agreement that temporarily ended more than a decade of war. The fighting had ended for American forces, where the North Vietnamese Communist government re-equipped its army and escalated the ground war in Vietnam. Meanwhile, the U.S. government continued to aid South Vietnam at a greatly reduced level. Consequently, several thousand U.S. citizens remained, many employees at the Defense Attaché Office complex at Tan Son Nhut Airport, at the U.S. Embassy compound in downtown Saigon, and 4 different consulates, Da Nang, Nha Trang, Bien Hoa, and Can Tho. Each of these sites retained a handful of U.S. Marine Guards. In August 74, Major General Homer D. Smith, USA, assumed command of the DAO, which is the Defense Attaché Office. He reported to Graham A. Martin, U.S. Ambassador to South Vietnam, and to Admiral Noel Gaylor, USN Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Command. Early in 75, Communist military forces in Vietnam prepared for a major offensive. Such an offensive was not likely to provoke a powerful American military response, such as the one launched in 72, because Dick Nixon had resigned in 74. In the wake of the Watergate scandal, the U.S. Congress showed little willingness to approve more aid for South Vietnam, much less a reintroduction of American forces into the conflict. During the first week in March, the North Vietnamese army attacked key bases in the central highland of South Vietnam. Ban My Thuot, on the highway between Saigon and the north central highlands, fell on March 14th, persuading South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu to withdraw his forces. Chaotic retreat followed. By the end of the month, enemy forces had captured strategic bases of Quang Tri, Hua Tam Quai, and Da Nang, the last 3 on the northern coast. Evacuation of Da Nang was chaotic. Communist forces had cut off land escape routes, leaving refugees and military forces alike dependent on sea lift or airlift. Ships evacuated thousands southward to other coastal bases. Commercial airlines under contract to evacuate American citizens were forced to carry panic-stricken Vietnamese soldiers and their families. The last airplane departed, a World Airway 727, carried out 290 passengers, at least 7 in its wheel wells. The air crew could not even retract the airliner's landing gear. During the first week in April, another key South Vietnamese coastal bases, the Cam Ranh Bay, Nha Trang, fell to the North Vietnamese sea lift, carried thousands more refugees to Vung Tau on the coast just southeast of Saigon and Phuong Quoc Island. Although some South Vietnamese fully expected U.S. airstrikes against the communists, President Ford refused to order them. He did announce on April 3rd the American military transports delivering military cargo to Saigon would return flights to the U.S. would evacuate Vietnamese orphans. That was nice of him. This operation, called Baby Lift, began tragically on April 4th. A giant C-5 Galaxy, then the largest airplane type in the world, landed in Saigon with artillery for the South Vietnamese army, and it took off with more than 200 orphans, escorted by 37 female DAO employees. And not long after taking off from Tan Son Nuit Airport, at the time it crossed the coast near Vang Tao, the C-5 suffered an explosive decompression in the cargo area. Deprived of its controls and massive airplane tail, Captain Dennis Trainer, U.S. Air Force, attempted to fly back to Saigon using the ailerons alone. Despite his best efforts, the huge airplane crash-landed in rice paddies short of Tan Son Nuit. Miraculously, 175 of the 330 were aboard. The C-5 survived the explosion and the crash. Thus began the airlift evacuation of the American citizens and Vietnamese refugees from Saigon. Although sabotage was never proven, fear of it slowed the airlift from Saigon. The U.S. Air Force used no more C-5s and tightened luggage inspections. Baby Lift was not a total failure. Other airplanes, including military transports, commercial airliners, under contract, eventually evacuated more than 2,600 Vietnamese orphans to Hawaii and on the continental United States. A number of factors contributed to the declining South Vietnamese morale during April. North Vietnamese forces continued to advance all across the country. On April 9th, they attacked Duong Loc, only 38 miles from Saigon. That same week, Communist Khmer Rouge forces captured Phnom Penh, capital of neighboring Cambodia, and the U.S. Marine Corps helicopters had to evacuate Americans there. If the trend continued, Saigon would also fall. It was a holiday in Cambodia. Ambassador Martin warned to persevere in an atmosphere of normality and calm in the South Vietnamese capital. He feared that a sudden, massive American evacuation would lead to the kind of panic that had erupted in Da Nang. And he wanted to prevent the collapse of the South Vietnamese government during the first part of April. U.S. Air Force C-141 Starlifters landed in Saigon with increased frequency to deliver military cargo to the southern Vietnamese. Available to evacuate U.S. citizens, third country nationals, and selected Vietnamese. At first, they carried only small fractions of their passenger capacity. The U.S. citizens with Vietnamese dependents refused to leave without them, and Vietnamese dependents faced time-consuming paperwork. They also wanted to take their extended families with them. Lines grew to a mile or more, and some people waited for more than 24 hours. C-141s often landed in Tan Son Nuit, and frequently they could take they could take off because of the time-consuming passenger processing and baggage checks. Consequently, at one time, 4 vulnerable star lifters sat on the ground at Tan Son Nuit. By April 19th, only about 6,000 evacuees had flown out of Vietnam. So the story that is being told here is they were still supporting the army. They were sending in army cargo, military cargo, and flying out with the people of interest. So when you have the army leave first, you can see the first problem of the logistics chains falling apart. The fixed wing evacuation went into high gear between April 20th and April 28th. Admiral Gaylor and Ambassador Martin simplified the paperwork that had delayed so many evacuees. President Ford authorized the evacuation of tens of thousands of, quote, at-risk, unquote, Vietnamese, even if they were not American dependents. In addition to the C-141s, U.S. Air Force C-130s from the 374th Tactical Airlift Wing at Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines began flying to and from Saigon on April 21st. The air evacuation became an around-the-clock operation with about 20 C-141s taking off every day and about 20 C-130s every night. Neither airplane type was authorized to carry more than 100 passengers, but each one in the later stages of the airlift carried 180 or more. There was other reasons for the accelerated aerial evacuation. By April 21st, 2/3 of the country's land area and 21 of the 44 South Vietnamese provincial capitals were in enemy hands. Time repeats itself. You're doomed to repeat it if you don't learn the lessons of it. The defenders of Giang Loc began withdrawing to Saigon. The North Vietnamese army cut the main highway between Saigon and Vung Tau and took crucial parts along the Saigon River, precluding a massive sea lift. In April 21st, President Thieu resigned, hoping the South Vietnamese leadership would persuade the communists to negotiate. But the North Vietnamese was not in a mood for compromise. The communists sensed total victory and hoped to occupy Saigon completely by the time of Ho Chi Minh's birthday in May. The North Vietnamese publicly announced that they would not oppose an American aerial evacuation of Saigon, but if it only took place immediately. See, that's what we think. That's what we start to think it happened to that Bagram Air Force Base. We know now because the New York Times had an article saying that when shit started to get crazy in Kabul, the Taliban reached out to the White House and said, "Hey, do you want us to calm the shit down here? Do you want us to calm this fucking place down? Or do you want to do it? But it's got to get done." And the White House was like, "No, dog, go ahead, you do it." Imagine that. On April 22nd, more than 3,000 evacuees flew out of Saigon. There was more each day. On April 26th, 27th, about 12,000 departed Tan Son Nuit on 46 C-130s and 28 C-141s. 74th Tactical Airlift Wing C-130s evacuated 250 dependents of South Vietnamese Marines from Vung Tau on the 27th. Shortly afterwards, more than 130 entered the operation, having deployed from the 314th Tactical Airlift Wing in Arkansas to the Philippines. Major Robert S. Delegati, U.S. Air Force, and later Colonel Earl E. Mickler, U.S. Air Force of the 7th Air Force, supervised the airlift to Tan Son Nuit, working in the Evacuation Control Center. They collaborated with Colonel Gavin McCurdy, DAO Air Attaché, and Brigadier General Richard T. Turry, the U.S. Air Force Pacific Theater Airlift Manager. By the end of April, the DAO had processed over 40,000 people for aerial evacuation. Initially, most evacuees flew to Clark, which was the Air Force base there in the Philippines. But on the 23rd, Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos announced that he would permit no more than 200 Vietnamese refugees in his country at a time. There were already more than 5,000 there. His new policy forced the Air Force to airlift refugees to Andersen Air Force Base in Guam and to Wake Island in the Central Pacific, where the U.S. military services hastily constructed huge camps. Read Combat Engineers. On April 27th, enemy rockets hit Saigon for the first time in years. They set off huge fire that left 5,000 people homeless. The attack ended the C-141 airlift because the Star lifters were more expensive and vulnerable than the C-130s, and because they were needed for shuttling passengers from the Philippines to Guam and Wake. And the C-130 airlift continued, but not for long. The next day, communist pilots and captured A-37s bombed Tan Son Nhut, temporarily halting the Hercules evacuation. After only 18 flights, it carried out 3,500 people. Ambassador Martin hoped to use 60 C-130 flights to complete the aerial evacuation of Saigon on April 29th, but communist rockets frustrated the planes. A pre-dawn artillery attack destroyed one C-130 and forced at least two to take off immediately, one with refugees and one with the burning C-130's crew. The runways also became full of evacuating South Vietnamese military aircraft, and mobs of people demanded to be taken away. By dawn of April 29th, the fixed-wing evacuation of Saigon was over. Between April 1st and 29th, the U.S. Air Force flew 201 C-141s and 174 C-130 sorties in the evacuation. Between April 5th and the 29th, the aircraft had evacuated more than 45,000 people from Saigon, including more than 5,600 U.S. citizens, thousands of refugees, and many U.S. citizens, including the ambassador, his staff, and many DAO members remained in Saigon when the last C-130 departed. 14 North Vietnamese Army divisions armed with anti-aircraft weapons surrounded the city. At this point, President Ford ordered the final aerial evacuation of Saigon by helicopters. And this is Operation Frequent Wind. So before we get further into our story, we need to talk about Air America. And I don't mean the leftist I don't mean the communist radio station. There's a thing called Air America. If you're a conspiracy person, you probably know Air America from like Barry Seal stories and this kind of stuff. It was a commercial aircraft company that was owned by the United States of America. Later, the story is that the CIA took control over it, and this is where, running drugs into Mena, Arkansas, which we talked about ad nauseum. Go check out the Clinton crime story episodes. I think there's 3 of them. If you want to know also about losing the war in Vietnam or walking away from the war in Vietnam, check out the feature topic link. There's a episode about the Pentagon Papers. I think it's called How We Stopped Winning the War, something like that. So anyhow, let's talk a little bit about these CIA documents that shed light on what Air America is. And this is from CBS in April 15th of 2009. Former naval aviator Don Boker isn't too proud to say that he was scared out of his wits on the July 1965 day in Laos when he dangled by one arm from a helicopter while enemy soldiers took aim below. Boker had spent the longest night of his life in thick jungle evading capture and certain execution while awaiting the rescue that Navy aviator had ejected after a bomb he intended to drop on the Ho Chi Minh Trail exploded prematurely. His rescuers that day, however, weren't from the American military, who couldn't be caught conducting a secret bombing campaign in Laos. They were civilians. They were civilian employees of Air America, an ostensibly private airline essentially owned and operated by CIA. Boker, now a 71-year-old retired rear admiral, plans to tell the story on Saturday in a symposium intended to give a fuller account on the important outfit that alumni say is still misunderstood by the American public. The University of Texas University of Texas at Dallas event coincides with the CIA's release of about 10,000 previously classified Air America records, which will be turned over to the school's aviation collection. Paul Olkrug, a coordinator of UT Dallas's Special Collection Department, said the documents would speak to the covert side of the Cold War. These Air America documents are essentially to outstanding a large untold history of American involvement of Southeast Asia. The records consist mainly of first-hand accounts of Air America missions and commendation letters from government officials, said Timothy N. Castle, a historian who works at the CIA's Center for Study of Intelligence. Included are accounts of the chaotic evacuation of personnel in 1975 after the fall of Saigon, the investigation into a mysterious 1964 plane crash apparently caused by sabotage, and a letter from President Dick Nixon commending employees for their bravery in Laos. More documents detail the rescue of wounded airmen from a mountainous Air Force radar station in Laos known as Lima Site 85, where a North Vietnamese raid in 1968 killed 11 Americans. It was the single largest loss of Air Force personnel on the ground during the Vietnam War. Castle said the survivors were rescued by Air America. Such operations were the norm for Air America pilots. The inspiration for the title of the symposium, Air America, Upholding the Airman's Bond. Between 1964 and 1965, Air America personnel rescued 21 downed American pilots. Strict records weren't kept after that, but if you extrapolate and anecdotally, we know that there were scores and scores more through those years. That is an airman's bond. There is another airman who is down. Everything stops until you, everything stops until you try to rescue them, because if it were you, you knew that they would do it for you. Air America's public face was that of a passenger cargo airline that operated in sometimes dangerous places. It formed after World War II under the name Civil Air Transport, and did contract work for Chinese nationals. Control of Air America eventually shifted to the CIA, which set up shell companies to disguise its true ownership. Planes kept flying scheduled passenger flights out of Taiwan, but they also began flying covert missions into Laos and South Vietnam to supply anti-communist forces. Air America, who had numerous government contracts, was involved in humanitarian work through a deal with the State Department. One of Air America's finest and most iconic moments was evacuating American and Vietnamese civilians after Saigon fell in 1975. A famous photograph shows an Air America helicopter atop of an apartment building as a long line of people wait to board it. Brian K. Johnson, former Air America helicopter pilot and president of Air America Association, said flight crews would race to be the first to pick up a downed military personnel. These untold stories of the Vietnam War, he said, could help change Air America's image. So I'm skipping ahead here. We have done everything we can to change the perception, and I think we're getting there. Johnson said the liberal Air America radio station, that didn't help either. I'm going to skip ahead a little just to finish it up. Most people don't even know it occurred. It was a secret society, said Boker, who has 6 children and 11 grandchildren. They flew in all sorts of danger, flying every day in terrible wartime conditions. They did a beautiful job. Now, a lot of hay's been made about this famous photograph that they were just talking about, especially in recent, weeks. But I found this by Reed Tucker. This was April 23rd of last year. So he goes on. Reed Tucker here writes this piece, says, almost everything you thought about the famed Fall of Saigon photo isn't true. It's one of the most iconic images of the Vietnam War. Hubert Van S's snapshot shows a military helicopter perched atop a U.S. embassy in Saigon as Americans stream up the stairway, desperately boarding the last flight out. Except that isn't a military helicopter. That's not a U.S. embassy. And those aren't Americans. And that wasn't the last flight out. And perhaps most surprising of all, the photo is not about defeat. As I was researching it, I found that almost everything I had assumed about that photo was wrong. Historian and author Thurston Clark tells the Post. The surprising tale of that photo, along with the complete story of the last days of the Vietnam War, was told in Clark's book, blah, blah, blah. I shouldn't blah, blah, blah. It's called The Honorable Exit, how a few brave Americans risked all to save the Vietnamese allies at the end of the war, published by Doubleday. Nearly minute-by-minute account of the United States pullout from the Quagmire conflict, and much of the story is encapsulated in that single photo taken April 29th, 1975. Early in 75, American prospects in Vietnam were looking bleak. The communists continued to push south, capturing territory and sending thousands of refugees fleeing for safety. After Da Nang fell, World Airlines, the government contractor tasked with flying troops and equipment out of the country, attempted that march to evacuate people from the city, leading to a chaotic scene that panicked Vietnamese tried to push their way on to a plane under heavy fire, managed to get airborne. They're stowaways. I feel like we just already talked about some of this stuff, so I'm going to jump ahead. Yet American leaders took a different path. They quickly began planning to evacuate as many Vietnamese as possible to resettle them in the United States. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger argued that on April 2nd State Department staff meeting that it was Americans' duty to get the people out who believed in us. It was our duty to get the people out that believed in us. A list of potential Vietnamese evacuees were compiled. They include high-ranking officials, translators, and other high-risk targets. Kissinger wired the U.S. Vietnamese ambassador, Martin, that failure to address these difficult questions of evacuation could result in the loss of U.S. lives, national dignity, and common sense of confidence that we can manage whatever crisis the future may hold. If you don't know the past, you're doomed to repeat it. Right after pudding time. By April 7, 1975, North Vietnamese troops had surrounded Saigon and it became a clear attack was imminent. Chaos erupted as residents scrambled to flee and tried to push their way into the U.S. Embassy in hopes of escaping. I'm going to skip back to this picture. I want to get back to this picture. On April 29th, copters fanned out across the city picking up hopefuls. So what they did is they identified 19 places or something. So instead of going, hey, the whole shit house is burning, everyone try to get to the airport. What they did is they had, and I mentioned this, I think, in the Joe Biden, the Eternal Recurrence of Joe Biden episode, is everybody knew what their extraction point was. And what they did is they played a certain song. It was some kind of Christmas song. They played this Christmas song and everybody ran to their intended extraction points. So on April 29th, copters fanned out across the city picking up the hopeful. The Hueys were operated by Air America, a line covertly run by the CIA. The 31 pilots flying the hazardous missions were volunteers. Nearly everyone who was asked stepped forward. Besides the embassy, one of the pickup points was at the Lee Hotel at 6 Chien Si Circle there. The ambassador had assembled a group of VIPs for evacuation. Manning one of the copters was O.B. Harnage, a macho, cigar-smoking, hard-drinking CIA officer who wore an eye patch after he was wounded by shrapnel in World War II. O.B., this is to you. And here's the swimming with bow-legged women. I should have said, here's mud in your eye, right? Yeah. Anyhow, Harnage's helicopter landed at the Lee Hotel, and the aircraft was quickly mobbed by desperate Vietnamese. One South Vietnamese soldier pushed forward towards Harnage and pulled the pin from a grenade, telling him, "We go with you, or I drop the grenade." Harnage shoved the barrel of a machine gun in the man's face and said, "Go ahead, you'll never get to hear it go off," and the soldier backed off. After the Lee Hotel became unsafe, the CIA station chief urged Harnage to start picking up the 22 guy Longstreet. The apartment building's top floor served as the headquarters of CIA employees. VIPs and other Vietnamese had been gathered at the location in hopes of a rescue. Wooden stairs had been built to the top of the roof's elevator shaft to aid in evacuation. Harnage made 3 pickups, packing 20 people into each flight. To make room for them all, he rode outside the bird, standing on the skid while gripping his machine gun. This is like something out of the A-Team. Remember, he wasn't taking people he worked with or knew, the author said. They were perfect strangers, and he was risking his life. Station chief had ordered him to concentrate on the VIPs, but Harnage decided to board on a first-come, first-served basis. Some parents handed him their children with heartbreaking notes pinned to the kids' clothes, such as, "My son wants to be a doctor, and my daughter is very musical." When a burly Korean diplomat tried to elbow other evacuees aside to make it onto one of the chopters, Harnage punched the man, leaving him bloody and chastened. He was later allowed on a flight. Harnage refused to let anyone aboard with more than one small bag, tossing everything else over the side of the building, including what was likely millions of dollars of hoarded gold. On the touchdown at Guy Longstreet, Van Ness was sitting in the offices of the United Press International for about 4 blocks away when a colleague called out, "Van Ness, get out here! There's a chopper on that roof!" Van Ness grew up in the Netherlands and decided to become a war photographer after seeing Frank Capra's pictures. He first worked in Hong Kong and South China Morning Post before heading to Vietnam to work for NBC and UPI. He grabbed his Nikon and a 300mm lens and began snapping. The shot that went around the world showed Harnage dressed in a white shirt and clutching a cigar between his teeth, reaching down the stairs to grab Tiet Tan Nuit Nguyen, a young doctor who would ultimately become an anesthesiologist in California. Next is Tong Hyo's other doctor who would eventually settle near Atlanta. The slender teenage girl is Tuet Dong Boy, who would go on to earn a degree in microbiology before becoming a biotech researcher. Just below her is her brother, who had traded his motorbike to the driver of a high-ranking military official in exchange for being shown to the building. Also on the ladder is South Vietnamese Minister of Defense Tran Van Don. The photo marked the last trip Harnage was able to make to the location, leaving dozens of people behind, watching the skies for a helicopter that would never appear. Flights continued elsewhere through the night. In the end, the airlift extracted some 1,373 Americans and 5,595 Vietnamese from Saigon in less than 24 hours. Harnage returned to America and became a real estate salesman. He died in 2008, and Van Ness was paid a one-time bonus of $150 for the photo. He continued covering conflicts and died in 2009. Clark says he hopes Van Ness's famous photo will be viewed in a new light. At the time, the photo seemed to be a metaphor for Vietnam, our first lost war and us scrambling away from the roof of the embassy. The author says it was a damning photo that fit into the narrative at the time. But he goes on to say, It was anti-heroic. But when you look at what is actually going on the rooftops, this was a moment of considerable heroism. All right, back to Daniel Haulman's piece. I think we're caught up now. At the dawn of April 29th, a fleet of Air America UH-1 helicopters began shuttling evacuees from the pre-selected Saigon rooftops to the DAD and Trans-on-Nuit, or the U.S. American Embassy. At the same time, there was a fleet of buses moved select evacuees from predetermined Saigon embassy points to the DAO, or to the embassy. A large Marine Corps CH-53 and CH-46 helicopters gathered on ships of the 7th Fleet off of the Vietnam coast to transport Marine Corps security forces and protect the DAO and the embassy and to extract evacuees. Each CH-53 would carry as many as 65 passengers. The U.S. Air Force played a key role in Operation Frequent Wind. 10 Air Force CH-53 and HH-53 helicopters from the 65th Special Operations Wing and the 40th Aerospace Rescue and Recovery Squadron in Thailand had deployed earlier in the month to the USS Midway in the South China Sea. Operation Frequent Wind was the first major operation involving the use of the Air Force helicopters from an aircraft carrier. 9 flew with the Marine Corps helicopters to Saigon in the final aerial evacuation. Colonel Lloyd J. Anders Jr. Commanded the Air Force contingent. The Navy pilots, or the Navy provided fighters from aircraft carriers as air cover for the helicopters, and the U.S. Air Force flew fighters and gunships including F-4s, A-7s, and AC-130s from bases in Thailand. Some of the F-4s attacked enemy aircraft artillery sites near the encircled capital. The Air Force also provided KC-135 tankers to refuel the fighters and C-130 airborne command and control aircraft to handle the air traffic. So do you see what I mean about logistics? I opened up at the beginning this thing, this Omar Bradley thing. It's not about tactics. It's not about strategy, it's about logistics. Imagine the brain power it took to organize all of this. Imagine the pre-planning it took. They were taking out artillery sites of the enemy, known artillery sites of the enemy. They had air cover. They had massive amounts of helicopters flying in and out. They had Marines on buses covering their rear as they were getting out of there. Imagine, or just do a contrast and compare to what happened last week. And I think that I don't want to belabor my point too much, but there is no part in this article here about how we left $8 billion worth of military hardware anywhere. And I know I've been talking to enough people to know that, the talking point or whatever is, well, they didn't leave it there. They left it with the Afghan army, who then left it there. Well, my point of that whole thing is well, when the Afghan army started putting down their weapons and taking off, someone should have reevaluated the fucking situation on the ground. I mean, you don't just leave armor personnel carriers and drones and Black Hawk helicopters. You don't just do that. So when I was in one time, one of the idiots in my company lost a pair of night vision goggles. And we were in some training area. I can't remember where it is, but they lost a pair of night vision goggles. And what happened for the whole force that was in the field training halted. It stopped. The reason it stopped is because night vision goggles are what's called sensitive items. And I don't think it has to do with how much they cost. You're not allowed to get a paramilitary, quote, military grade night vision goggles. You are not allowed to own them. You're not allowed to own them because it changes the battlefield. I don't know. I'm not going to get into the whole thing. However, when one of my idiots lost a pair of night vision goggles, it turned into disciplinary action. It turned into stopping the training of the United States Army in this specific training, this gigantic training area, and everyone got in a fucking line, like hands length apart, and walked grids until someone found this fucking thing. And then the kid got in trouble for it after that. Of course, he upsetted the whole balance of the whole thing. So I'm just saying, like, someone should be talking about some, they left more than one night vision goggle out there. Meanwhile, I'm thinking about how I'm going to get in there because I want to get one of those armored personnel carriers, bro. All right, back to it. Enough babbling. Despite careful planning, Operation Frequent Wind did not proceed on schedule. Crowds of panic-stricken Vietnamese blocked bus routes in downtown Saigon. They surrounded the embassy in the DAO complex. South Vietnamese military forces at Tan Son Nhut demanded evacuation for themselves and their families. And I wonder why everyone's trying to get the fuck out of there. Oh, because the communists are coming. All right, enemy raids at the airport had knocked out the Air America helicopter refueling facility, forcing the UH-1s to fly all the way back to the fleet to refuel. Many more refugees gathered at the embassy than expected, and evacuation from that site did not begin until almost dark. There was confusion over the scheduling, with the cover flights arriving in Saigon some 3 hours before the large helicopter from the fleet. Bad weather complicated an already confusing operation. During Frequent Wind, 71 military helicopters flew 662 sorties between Saigon and the elements of the 7th Fleet. The operation succeeded in extracting more than 7,800 evacuees from the DAO in the U.S. Embassy on April 29th and 30th, not counting U.S. Marines that had landed that day on 4 round trips between the Midway and Saigon. Air Force helicopters evacuated more than 1,400 people, counting fighter, tanker, and command and control flights. The U.S. forces flew a total of 1,422 sorties over Saigon, and the final day of the operation ended before 9 a.m. April 30th. Shortly after noon, communist flags were flying from Saigon's presidential palace. All right, I'm going to skip down to the bottom here. Members of the armed services drew several lessons from the evacuation experience. Fragmented command and control hinder the operation, especially during frequent wind. A single military commander and not the ambassador should have controlled all military forces involved in the final phases of the execution. Not all participants in frequent wind agreed on scheduling, leading to confusion over launch time of the large helicopters. A single agency should have defined the reference hour for execution. The definition of who qualified for airlift evacuation kept changing, which routinely expanded the numbers of refugees to be evacuated. The Vietnamese evacuation demonstrated the value of a single theater airlift manager, the effectiveness of integrated strategic and tactical airlift resources, and the critical importance of adequate ground support personnel to mission success. The aerial evacuation of Vietnam was the largest in history. More than 50,000 people fled by the air. The majority of Air Force craft, almost all U.S. citizens, left by the air. Operation Frequent Wind ended more than 20 years of U.S. involvement in Vietnam. All right, well, hey, so that's it. I mean, I don't really have any closing thoughts. I think that we kind of went over everything that I want to talk about, without getting too in the weeds. I just want to kind of explain, and talk a little bit about, using your resources, knowing how many people is on the ground, knowing how many people you want to evacuate. Even if that number changed as the situation evolved and developed, that's fine. I believe that they still knew how many Americans were on the ground, right? At the beginning of the show, I mentioned that, I thought that there might have been some troops left behind. I didn't mean that they were left behind from the evacuation. I think that they were captured as POWs, and we never figured out how to get them back. Never bothered to get them back. I did an episode about that a while ago. You could find it in the featured topic link in the modern military era. Maybe, I don't know. It's in there. It's in there someplace. Missing POWs. But if you're, and you might be sitting there going why are we talking about this? Can we just talk about wizards and blowjobs again? I'm like, look, dude, we're talking about history. It's the second one: occult, history, conspiracy, and violence. So we're talking about violence. And then in some kind of way, we're also talking about a conspiracy, right? It's a conspiracy because it's no one remembers this lesson. It's obvious. Everyone knows to point at it as a narrative thing. Look, it's a train wreck. Look, it's just like Saigon. But look, there is lessons to be learned. And it doesn't seem like anyone paid attention to it. And the fact that it echoes, the fact that what just happened in Afghanistan, the circumstances revolving around it, echoes so clearly to how we ended it in Vietnam, is so, I don't know, mind-blowing. It's 20 years. It's the same fucking thing. They were moving in. We were moving out. It's the two are not mutually exclusive. Anyhow, I have been John Towers, and this has been the Abracast. And when I do these sort of current events, or I don't know how to describe the episodes, but they're usually bonus episodes. So in case you want to skip them, you can without any kind of serious continuity issues. All right. Everybody have a good long weekend. And remember, there's police out there, and they don't give a fuck about your rights. And they're looking for you. If you're partying a little too hard, don't be behind the wheel. Call one of those fucking rideshare things. Fuck, sleep in a ditch, something. Save yourself a couple $1,000. Possibly some bad karma. Anyhow, I'm John. This is the Abracast. Catch you guys in a few days. Right. Out. Over and out.
You can find Stigmata Studios, graphic novels, and comic books. Take control of your destiny. Understand your past. Put your present in context and know your future with a twist. Check out the designs and watch the videos about the Abracast tarot card deck. Your body is your temple, so let's make sure you got a badass t-shirt on it. Variety of cool occult themed t-shirts and other merch like stickers, wall art, mugs, and more. Welcome to the Red Archive. Get access to over 50 hours of archived episodes, more bonus audio, additional exclusive content. All this for only $1 a month. Are you interested in the occult, history, conspiracy, and violence? Learn more at Abracast.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope that you enjoyed the show. Please send an email or find us on social media and let us know what you think about the show. We would appreciate it if you would give us a 5-star rate and review wherever you find your favorite podcasts.